about to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Shirley Lung, who is presenting on Taiwanese churches in diaspora and ethnic identity formation. Shirley Lung is currently a visiting assistant professor of sociology at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and an incoming assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Denver. She received her PhD in sociology from the Johns Hopkins University. Her current research is on transnational Taiwanese Protestant networks between the US and Taiwan, focusing on the relationships among three Taiwanese in name church organizations. She studies Taiwanese ethnic identity formation within this transnational organizational field. Her work has been funded by the Global Religion Research Initiative at the University of Notre Dame, the Louisville Institute, and the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs, among others. She has published in religions. And just as a side note, as I've gotten to know Shirley and her work throughout the years, she has done incredible field work, both within the US context and in Taiwan, pertaining to Taiwanese Christians, especially Taiwanese Presbyterians. And I always go to Shirley to talk about Taiwanese Presbyterians because she, to me, is one of the world authorities on the subject. So, Shirley, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shirley Lung. Thank you to David for that great introduction. As he noted, my project is on my talk today is Taiwanese churches in diaspora and ethnic identity formation. In one of my first interviews for this project, I spoke with a young Taiwanese American Christian whom I'll call Thomas, and he discussed how he found his then church community. Little did I know at the time how much this first interview would reveal about the links between ethnic identity and faith. So, Thomas notes, originally, I didn't want to come to visit this particular Taiwanese church because there's these politics involved. But the first couple churches we visited were Chinese churches, and my wife wasn't that into it. I told her that in Taiwan, Christianity is only 4% of the population, and fewer young people coming to the US from Taiwan. Fewer are even Christian. So either we burst our little bubble and mingle with Chinese Christians, or we go to the Formosan church. Now, before Thomas told me his rationale for how he was choosing a church to attend, he had to give me this really long historical preface about martial law period and immigration and so forth in the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan. And he felt that this history lesson was necessary in showing why he chose to worship at a Taiwanese church rather than a Chinese church or another kind of church. So for him, worshiping with other Taiwanese people and sometimes in the Taiwanese language is meaningful in multiple ways and helps him and his wife feel a sense of belonging. So, the scientists have contrasted these ways of belonging that Thomas tried really hard to convey as compared with ways of being. So both being and belonging refer to being part of a group of some kind and like an institution or organization. But when you belong to a group compared with just being in a group, you consciously identify with that group. You actively signal that identity. For instance, I'm part of the greater Denver community right now, but I don't really identify with that label. In contrast, I identify as Asian Americans, and I signal that by being part of the AAPI groups, by discussing AAPI issues with my friends and my colleagues. So, this feeling of belongingness takes us to the process of group formation, which is literally how groups form. So, key to thinking about group formation is the negative space. So, who is outside of the group? Who is on the boundary? What makes people in the group belong to that group? In my specific case, what makes Taiwanese immigrants, specifically Taiwanese Christians, Taiwanese? Is it lineage? Is it familial experiences or connections? or political views, as Thomas was pointing to. I think it's all of these factors. And most importantly, when these particular packages or arrangements or constellations of these factors come together. And this leads us to when we're thinking about the Taiwanese American or Taiwanese immigrant community, migration and specifically time of migration is especially significant. The package of those group formation factors we were talking about before, or social relations, package of social relations at that time of peak migration sets the tone for the social relations in the immigrant community. In other words, because the immigrant community is made up largely of those coming from Taiwan between the 1960s and the 1980s, plus their descendants, that means the social relations of that time period are, in a sense, preserved within the immigrants themselves. They carry the traumatic experiences of Taiwan's martial law period, the image of the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan as an activist church fighting for democracy, anti authoritarian, and anti communist attitudes, all from that time period. So, this brings me to my argument, which is that the social relations um, at those peak times of migration still have an impact or influence contemporary social relations in the community. Um, so now let's go into the package or constellation of social relations at that time of peak. So push factors and pull factors are migration terms. And push factors refers to factors that literally push people out of the country, like war or economic downturn, and versus the pull factor in the receiving countries, those that pull people into the country, like economic opportunities, hope for a better life, things like that. For Taiwanese immigrants, the push factors really began in 1949 so in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang or the KMT government lost the Chinese Civil War to the Chinese communists. They came to Taiwan with over 1 million mainlanders and enforced a brutal era of martial law on the island until 1987. Chiang Kai-shek essentially moved the Republic of China, the ROC, government to Taiwan, governing Taiwan as a party state through the KMT. So suddenly, people in Taiwan had a new government, and the ethnic and racial landscape is transformed. With the arrival of the mainlanders, the people in Taiwan then became local Taiwanese. The people who remained in China became People's Republic of China or PRC Chinese. So these three new ethnic groups, local Taiwanese, mainlanders, and PRC Chinese, were formed after the war, and their social and political relationships have then affected group boundaries in their community since then. So questions like who counts as Taiwanese, who counts as Chinese, have been complicated by their evolving social and political relationships. The KMT government during the martial law period was authoritarian. They enacted violence against local Taiwanese and sometimes against mainlanders as well. Events like the Kaohsiung incident and the 228 massacre resulted in the deaths of thousands of local Taiwanese at the hands of the government. There were also countless arrests. Furthermore, the KMT enforced a policy of Mandarinization. And this means students and people in general were forced to speak Mandarin in schools and other institutions or public settings. And it also emphasizes mainlanders as the true Chinese people as compared to PRC Chinese and local Taiwanese. And because the mainlanders came with KMT, there's historical hostility between mainlanders and local Taiwanese, with mainlanders being associated with that violent and authoritarian government. The 1960s, then, because of all of this, because of these bleak prospects, begins a period of mass emigration from Taiwan. So let's look at the push factors through some of these testimonies. Um, the history is important because these memories still impact how Taiwanese immigrants today think about their ethnic identity. Bart is someone I interviewed at the beginning of my fieldwork, and he is a pastor in a Taiwanese church. All of these names are changed, anonymized, by the way. Um, and Bart here describes his experience of feeling culturally inferior during the martial law period. He notes, when I was in Taiwan more than 3 decades ago, back then Taiwan was still under martial law. So strictly, we were only allowed to speak Mandarin in schools. The education we received shaped us to identify as Chinese rather than Taiwanese. Taiwanese was more or less classified as backwards, a little backwards. If you speak Taiwanese in school, maybe the teacher would give you a punishment. They would say things like, the Taiwanese opera is not as good as the Beijing opera. Sam, another retired pastor in a Taiwanese church, brings up similar sense of alongside the inferiority that Bart mentioned. Sam describes the personal violence of the martial law period, and that how that affects both his faith and the ways in which he thinks about being Taiwanese today. Um, Sam says, I am 83 years old. My family became Christian from the time of my grandfather. During the 228 massacre, my church pastor was killed by KMT. That's why I never ever, as a Christian, will identify myself as Chinese. So my Taiwanese identity is very strong. For Sam, the KMT's imposition of their specific brand of Chinese culture is deeply embedded in a sense of Taiwanese identity, and enforces specific ethnic boundaries between Chinese and Taiwanese. Now, back to the timeline. As for the pull factors on the US side, because the KMT and the US government were anti communist allies, the two governments collaborated in sending the best and the brightest and well connected Taiwanese students, including both mainlanders and local Taiwanese, to the US for graduate study during the martial law period. Approximately 90 to 95% of these graduate students then settled in the US afterwards. This coincided with that landmark Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which drew large numbers of Asian immigrants to the United States. Again, Taiwanese immigrants, like others from Asia, were hyper selected as a result of the Immigration Act criteria, meaning they tend to be higher educated than both the general population in the US and in Taiwan. So, on the US side, what do the Chinese/Taiwanese um, immigrant communities look like? These are the three post 1949 ethnic groups that we examined: the local Taiwanese, mainlanders, and PRC Chinese. So during the 1960s and 1980s, local Taiwanese and mainlanders came to the US as mostly students, but also professionals and also through family reunification. These avenues offered that legal pathway to permanent residency and citizenship. And immigration from Taiwan began to decline with Taiwan's democratization into the end of martial law period during the 1980s. And this ushered in Taiwan's current two-party system. With the decline of Taiwanese immigration in the 1980s came the rise of that from China, with China's opening up also in the 80s. So you have a decline in Taiwanese immigration and an increase in immigration from China. So more PRC Chinese are arriving in the US through very much the same ways as students, professionals, and family reunification. And their presence is uniquely felt in the Taiwanese community. So since 1949, Both the ROC and the PRC have stylized themselves as the true China. So when the KMT and the US were World War II allies and anti-communist allies, the tides eventually the tides eventually shifted in favor of the PRC domestically and internationally. This means that in 1979, Taiwan, as the Republic of China, lost its seats in the UN to the PRC, which was formally recognized as the real China. And in 1979, the US stopped recognizing the Republic of China in Taiwan as China. As the ROC lost international and political clout, their sovereignty was increasingly called into question. So since 1949, the PRC has maintained a one China principle. And this means that there's only one China and it's ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, and Taiwan's part of China, not an independent country. Um, so as we can see, Taiwan's historical and current contested sovereignty, as well as these current tense cross-strait relations with China, have affected the social relations in immigrant communities where these historical events still have resonance. Okay. So now let's get into the church relationship specifically. Now that we gone over the historical background underpinning the importance of migration and ethnic identity formation. Um, on the Taiwan side, we have the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan, or PCT, in red. And this starts off. So the PCT originally began as a colonial church during the 19th century, but eventually leadership becomes local Taiwanese post-war. With the first General Assembly of the PCT being in 1951. So this is the first General Assembly with local Taiwanese leadership. It is a church that's been around since Japanese colonization of Taiwan. At the bottom level, the third level, we have what I call the American descendant churches, because many of the founders were former PCT members or somehow inspired by the PCT style of worship. Of course, there were also founders that came from other religious backgrounds as well, but a fair number of them were former PCT members. So the Evangelical Formosan Church, or the EFC, in purple, and then you have the Taiwanese Presbyterian Church, or TPC, in green. And the TPC is not they're not an independent denomination. They are affiliated with PCUSA. And PCUSA and PCT are partner churches, and there are PCUSA mission co-workers in Taiwan and other forms of exchange. To my knowledge, EFC and PCT do not have a formal relationship, but there are many informal ties that I can also talk about in Q&A. There are also other independent Taiwanese churches or other collections of Taiwanese churches affiliated with other mainline denominations, but these were the ones that I focused on. So, building on the PCT martial law legacy, many American Taiwanese immigrants rallied for democracy when they came to the US. So the PCT issued several human rights statements during the 1970s and 1980s. They were one of the few organizations, let alone churches, that spoke out against authoritarian rule and in favor of democracy. PCT General Secretary, Reverend Dr. CM Gao, along with other PCT leaders, were arrested and imprisoned in their fight for democracy. And while they may not be the same, while they may not be the same church today that they were during the martial law period, longtime members and administrators still intensely recall what happened during that time, especially the legacy of Reverend Gao. So, PCT members and administrators mix worship with activism. Mary is a retired pastor in TPC, and she describes not only the normalcy of KMT espionage of the time period, but also her own investment in Taiwan's democratization. Um, Mary notes, when I was the coordinator of a student center in Taiwan for PCT, it was under martial law. We know every local Taiwanese group, like PCT, had someone spying on them, writing reports to KMT. We were not just doing Bible study, but we were active in a lot of social issues and later the democracy movement. So again, it's the mixing worship with activism, fighting for religious freedom alongside political freedom. This is a newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune in 1980. And it came out right after Reverend Gall was arrested. So, Reverend Gall was suspected of harboring a fugitive and imprisoned for more than 4 years. And this newspaper clipping shows a Taiwanese American church, not the ones that I study, but it shows that they're protesting the arrest all the way from the US. So they feared a new wave of religious persecution after the arrest. And it shows that long distance nationalism of Taiwanese Christians, especially in their continued investment in the PCT and how PCT animates their activism, even after migration. So now let's move on to the American churches that I study. Okay. Uh, As noted before, Taiwanese Christians were among those graduate students and professionals looking for a better life in the US. They were galvanized by newfound US American democracy to create the first Taiwanese in name or Formosan in name organizations, which was suppressed in Taiwan during martial law. While the Christian population is about 4% in Taiwan, it is approximately 20% in the American immigrant and descendant community. And this shows that religion is a strong site of social support in the community. So Taiwanese graduate students formed campus fellowships at first, and eventually some moved into other Chinese congregations, Cantonese congregations, before forming their own. And the first up is EFC. Um, an EFC is an independent denomination. Its founders are local Taiwanese immigrants. Nonetheless, organizationally, EFC does look like PCT. They have a general assembly that facilitates interaction with their local churches, but on a much smaller scale. And they expanded worldwide. Their local churches typically operate with a three-language model, meaning their worship services in Chinese, in Mandarin, Taiwanese, and English. And they also began with Taiwan. They began with Taiwanese services only, but expanded to the three-language model with a decline in migration from Taiwan and increase in Taiwanese literate and decline in Taiwanese literate immigrants. Second, also founded in California are the first TPC churches. TPC churches are all over the US, but mainly West Coast. Um, and oh, I'm sorry. But mainly West Coast. And so this means that TPC is not independent. So they are affiliated with PCUSA. They're not independent, but this is a collective of 40 churches, and they're still quite autonomous. They tend to have primarily Taiwanese and sometimes English services. Sometimes TPC are, some of them are working on integrating Mandarin services, but there's still some resistance. And some informants have noted that TPC sometimes appears to have closer relationships with PCT rather than PCFA. To review, my argument is social relations at peak times of migration have an impact on contemporary social relations. And another way to put this is that immigrant communities are sort of like time capsules, with those key events leaving their imprint as the unique social relations within the community. Some social scientists have said that time is frozen in these communities. But I think that Taiwanese immigrants are not stuck in the past, but rather that significant events of the past become a lens through which to interpret the present. So one key way that the social relations of the 60s and the 80s comes through is through the maintenance or recognition of those post 1949 ethnic group relationships among local Taiwanese, mainlanders, and PRC Chinese. So I do want to iterate that all my informants have been invitational to everyone interested in joining these churches. No one has said, if you're not this kind of immigrant or this kind of Taiwanese or Chinese person, you can't come here. Social relations operate in a far more subtle way. They can show up in depths of friendship, or levels of participation and areas like that. So the first one I'll look into is the is ethnic divides. Matthew is a second generation Taiwanese American who is currently trying to get ordained in PCT in Taiwan. So he's Asian American second generation, but he's attempting to get ordained in through PCT. The ethnic divides between local Taiwanese and mainlanders have come up here mainly through language and a reference to politics. Um, Matthew notes, I'm fourth generation PCT. And what comes with being Presbyterian is politics. Growing up, my dad said we're not allowed in Mandarin churches. When I was a kid, I didn't even know Taiwanese people spoke Mandarin. I thought that was just in China. Chinese was banned in our family. It has to do with my dad's upbringing. Originally, when the Chinese came to Taiwan, he used to get into fights with them. It's a lot of bad memories for him. This time capsule effect passes down to the second generation. Mainlanders are still Chinese in that historical sense. Matthew's description of his father's traumatic martial law experience and the ways in which the experience guides a specific definition of being Taiwanese and specifically Taiwanese Presbyterian. So it's strongly tied to language and this idea of worshiping in Taiwanese and Main churches. The second social relation is tenuous ethnic solidarity. So Rachel is an EFC churchgoer, just a local congregant. She's a mainlander and she describes complexity of being in a Taiwanese church. She notes, I relate to those who came from Taiwan. We spent our childhoods in Taiwan, raised in the same education system. We all eat the same foods. Of course, we would feel a close connection. But if I meet those who are very pro independence, then I'll feel uncomfortable. I won't be able to identify with them. I don't hate them. I don't hate anyone. Um, in the 1970s, those pro independence people really despised us mainlanders. So Rachel's discomfort goes back to martial law rather than contemporary struggles for Taiwanese independence. She's noted in other parts of the interview that she doesn't pay that much of attention to politics in Taiwan today. So the independence movement for her is, in a sense, conflated or colored by Taiwan's democratization movement in the 80s and the activism in the 70s before that. Um, there's also more solidarity internally among immigrants from Taiwan when they're confronted with a PRC Chinese other. Larry, who's a researcher in PCT, describes his experience when he came to an American church. He notes, have you ever heard these stories about PRC Chinese taking over the church? It was a church in the US, originally mostly Taiwanese members. Then more and more Chinese came in. They voted out the Taiwanese pastor, and then it was no longer a Taiwanese church. It's scary. It's real. This fear of Chinese taking over is a common theme in my interviews. Informants range from taking it very seriously to thinking it's overblown. So while the ethnic boundary between mainlanders and local Taiwanese may soften, blur, become ambiguous, this one remains fairly difficult to traverse. Occasionally, this fear may be associated with martial law era or generally Cold War anti-communism.